I want to tell you what I did, because I think I am running out of time to tell anyone, and because the part of me that has been managing this story for 12 years is getting tired, and when that part of me gets tired, things happen in my house that I cannot explain to my wife. I am 58 years old. I have been married for 33 years. I worked for the same regional insurance company for 21 of those years, listening to people describe the worst weeks of their lives. And I was good at the job because I had a talent for not flinching. I am telling you that up front, so you understand that I am not the kind of man who scares easily, and I am not the kind of man who invents things. And when I tell you that I answered something one night that should not have been answered, I need you to hear it from a person who spent his whole adult life paid to be the calm one in the room. I answered it. One word. At a kitchen table in a cabin 4 hours from my house. And nothing in my life has been quite the same shape since. And last week my wife asked me a question at dinner that I do not know how to live with. And that is why I am finally saying this out loud. I am going to start at the beginning. But I want you to know that the beginning is not the cabin. The beginning is a Thanksgiving 15 years ago, when my uncle, who was 81 and quiet and had been a widower for a long time, leaned across the table after the plates were cleared and told me that the cabin he was going to leave me was a place where a man could hear himself think, and that this was not always a good thing. I nodded. I thanked him. I did not ask him what he meant. I have spent the last 12 years wishing I had asked him what he meant, because I think he was trying to warn me, and I think the not asking was the first decision I made in a long sequence of decisions that I am still inside of. He died 2 years later. I inherited the cabin the year I turned 46. Along with a strip of land that ran down to a creek nobody fished anymore, and a logging road that the county had stopped grading sometime in the 90s. It was not a hideaway. It was not a project. It was a place I went to when the noise of being a functional adult got loud enough that I needed a week of doing simple things badly. I want to say up front that nothing about the cabin was wrong. I keep meeting people who expect that part of the story to come early. The warning, the bad feeling, the dog that won't go inside. There was no dog. There was no warning. The cabin was a one-room building with a loft, a wood stove that drew well if you knew which damper to leave cracked, and a window over the sink that looked out at a stand of cedars so old they had stopped competing with each other and had simply agreed on a shape. The first thing I noticed, the small thing, was the radio. I had brought a hand-crank emergency radio, the kind people buy after a storm and then leave in a closet, and I had set it on the shelf above the sink, because the shelf above the sink was where my uncle had kept his. I cranked it the first evening to check the weather, more out of ritual than need. I got the county station for about 30 seconds before it slid sideways into static. That was not unusual. The cabin sat in a soft pocket between 2 ridges, and reception came and went with the wind. What was unusual was that, when I let the crank wind down and set the radio back on the shelf, I could still hear something underneath the static. Not a voice. Not yet. A rhythm. Like somebody breathing into a microphone at the wrong end of a long hallway. I turned it off. I made dinner. I did not think about it again until I was lying in the loft listening to the cedars move and realizing I could hear the rhythm without the radio on at all. Then I understood it was just my own pulse in the pillow, and I laughed at myself the way men my age laugh when nobody's watching, which is to say, not really. That should have been the end of it. In the version of my life where I am a slightly different man, it was the end of it. I want you to understand that I am not building toward a haunting. I am building toward a decision. The decision is mine. It was already forming in me before anything strange happened, which is the part I have spent 12 years trying to say correctly. On the second day I walked the property line. My uncle had marked it once with blue paint on the trees, and the paint had faded to the color of an old bruise. But you could still follow it if you knew to look low, where the bark had grown around the marks and held them like scars. I walked the whole loop, about an hour and a half at my pace. At the southwest corner, where the land dropped toward the creek, I found something I had not expected. A folding camp chair, set up, facing away from my cabin and toward a clearing on the neighboring parcel, which as far as I knew belonged to nobody, or to a holding company that had bought up timber rights and forgotten about them. The chair was not new. The fabric had faded on the side that would have caught the afternoon sun, and one of the leg caps was missing. But it was not abandoned either. There was a clean ring of dirt around each foot, the kind of ring that forms when something sits in one place long enough for the rain to drip off it in the same pattern over and over. Somebody had been using that chair, recently enough that the rings had not filled in, long enough that they had formed at all. I stood there for a while. I am the kind of man who stands instead of acts, and I have made peace with that about myself in some areas, and not in others. I looked at the chair. I looked at the clearing it faced. I tried to understand what a person would be watching from there. The clearing was unremarkable, a flat patch of grass, some low brush, the suggestion of an old skid trail running off into the trees. Nothing to see. Nothing happening. And then I noticed the second thing, and I want to be careful about how I say this, because in the moment I told myself it was nothing. On the armrest of the chair, in the place where a person's right hand would naturally rest, the fabric was darker, not stained, worn smooth, the way the handle of a tool gets worn smooth by years of the same hand in the same position. I put my own hand on it for a second, just to see, and my hand fit the worn place, exactly, and I took my hand off the chair faster than I want to admit. I went back to the cabin. I did not move the chair. I did not call anyone. I told myself that the land on the other side of the line was not my business, and that hunters sometimes set up in odd places, and that the missing leg cap suggested neglect rather than a current presence. All of that was true. None of it was the reason. The reason was that I had driven 4 hours to be alone, and acknowledging the chair would have meant I was not. That night, the radio did the thing again. I had cranked it for the morning forecast and forgotten to switch it off, and around 11 I heard, under the static, what I now had to admit was a voice. Not words, a cadence, the shape a sentence makes when you can hear it through a wall but cannot make it out. It went on for maybe 20 seconds. Then the static resolved into the county station for a moment, a man reading livestock prices, and then back into the cadence, and then nothing. I told myself it was bleed from another station. I told myself the ridges did strange things to signal. I told myself a lot of things, and then I got up and turned the radio off at the switch, not just let it wind down, and I put it inside the wood stove, which was cold, because some part of me wanted a barrier between the radio and the room that was thicker than air. In the morning I took the radio out of the stove and put it back on the shelf, and felt slightly ridiculous. This is, I think, one of the things people who have not lived through an unusual week do not understand. The strangeness does not announce itself. It accumulates. Between each accumulation there is a stretch of ordinary hours in which you feel foolish for having taken the previous night seriously. You eat a sandwich. You sweep the porch. You consider whether you should drive into town for a newspaper, and you decide against it, because the drive is 40 minutes each way, and the news will be the same news. The strangeness waits. It is patient in a way that nothing in your daily life has prepared you for. On the third day, I saw the man. He was on the other side of the property line, near the camp chair, and he was not sitting in it. He was standing, about 10 feet from it, with his back to me, looking at the clearing. He was wearing a dark green jacket and a knit cap, and he was holding something at his side that I could not identify from the distance. He was not large. He was not small. He was the size of a person, which is the only honest description I can give, because everything else I might say about his build I am inventing from later. I was on my own porch when I saw him. I had a cup of coffee in my hand, and I had just sat down in the rocker my uncle had built from a kit in 1987. I saw the green of the jacket against the brown and gray of the woods, and I went still in the way animals go still, which is to say I stopped breathing on purpose. He did not turn around. He stood there for what I would estimate was 4 minutes, though I did not look at my watch. Then he walked away into the trees on the far side of the clearing, in a direction that would have taken him deeper into the holding company's land and away from any road I knew about. But here is the thing. I have not told anyone, and the thing I want to tell you now, because if I leave it out, I am doing the same managing I have always done. When he walked away, he walked the wrong way. The clearing on his side of the line was open ground, with a clear path along the skid trail. He did not take it. He walked into the brush, into the part of the woods where you have to push branches aside to get through. And he did it without pushing branches aside. The branches did not move. He went between them, the way water goes between rocks, and the woods closed up behind him without disturbance. I sat on the porch for another half hour. I finished the coffee. I told myself I had been looking from the wrong angle. I told myself the brush was thinner than it looked. I made a list in my head of the reasonable explanations. A surveyor, a hunter scouting, a neighbor I had never met, a man who liked to walk in the woods, which is a thing men like me do. All reasonable, all possible. None of them accounted for the way he had gone through the trees. I am going to ask you something here, and I want you to be honest with yourself, because the answer matters for the rest of what I am going to tell you. If you had seen what I saw, on the third day of a week you had set aside to be alone, would you have driven into town and reported it? Would you have called the sheriff, or the holding company, or your wife? Or would you have done what I did, which was nothing, because nothing was easier, and you were on vacation and the man had walked away? I am not asking to make you feel bad. I am asking because I have spent 12 years suspecting that most people would have done what I did, and that this is not a comfort, but a description of a problem. That night the voice on the radio said my name. It did not say it clearly. I want to be careful here. It said something that, in the moment, I heard as my name. In the morning I was able to convince myself it had been a syllable that resembled my name. By the afternoon I had downgraded it to a sound that had probably been nothing at all. But in the moment, lying in the loft with the radio off on the shelf below me and the cedars moving against the window, I heard, under what should have been silence, a voice to say what I took to be the first half of my given name, and then break off, as if the speaker had been interrupted or had thought better of it. I did not get up. I did not turn on the light. I lay there with my eyes open and listened to the cabin breathe. At some point I fell asleep, because that is what the body does when the mind has run out of options. In the morning, I took the batteries out of the radio. I put them in a drawer. I put the radio in the drawer with them, and I closed the drawer, and I made breakfast, and I told myself that I had been tired, and that tired men hear things, which is true, and which is also the kind of true that lets you avoid a harder true. The next 2 days I will compress, because nothing happened in them that I did not already understand was going to happen. I saw the man twice more, both times at a distance, both times near the chair, both times with his back to me. I did not see his face. I did not approach. I did not leave. I had brought enough food for the week, and I was not going to let a stranger on a neighboring parcel chase me out of a place I had driven 4 hours to occupy. That is what I told myself. What I should have told myself was that I was already doing the thing I do, which is to wait out a discomfort by pretending it is weather. But there was one thing on the 4th day, one small thing. I want to mention it because I have learned over the years that the small things are the ones I tried hardest not to see. I went out to split kindling around 4 in the afternoon. The light was already going. When I came back inside, the radio, which I had left in the drawer with the batteries out, was on the shelf above the sink. The batteries were in it. The crank was halfway extended, the way you leave a crank when you have been turning it, and stopped part way through. I stood in the doorway with the kindling in my arms, and I looked at the radio for a long time, and then I set the kindling down by the stove, and I went to the shelf, and I took the radio down. The batteries were warm, not from sitting in the sun. The shelf was nowhere near the window. They were the warmth of batteries that had been worked. I want you to notice that I did not leave. I want you to notice that I did not get in the truck. I put the radio back on the shelf. I left the batteries in it. I told myself, and I remember the exact phrasing because I have repeated it to myself many times since, that I must have done it before I went outside and forgotten. That was the explanation I chose. I chose it because it was the explanation that allowed me to stay. On the 5th night, I answered back. This is the part of the story I have rehearsed the most and explained the worst, and I want to do it carefully, because the rehearsal is part of what's wrong with me. I had put the radio back on the shelf that afternoon, the same radio I had been pretending I had never moved. I had told myself I wanted the weather forecast, and that was true. But it was the kind of true that's a coat thrown over a different true. I wanted to know if the voice was still there. I wanted to know if I had imagined it. I wanted, in some way I am still not proud of, to be in the room with it again, because the alternative was to be in the room with only myself. And after 5 days of only myself, I was running short on patience for my own company. The voice came in around 10. The static built up the way it had before, a kind of breathing rhythm, and then under it, the cadence. And then the cadence sharpened into something almost like words. I sat at the kitchen table with the radio in front of me, and I leaned in, and I said out loud, in the voice of a man who was tired of pretending, "What?" Just that. One word. Not even a question, really. A flat acknowledgement that something was speaking, and I was listening. The static stopped. I want you to understand what I mean by stopped. It did not fade. It did not resolve into a station. It cut, the way a recording cuts when somebody hits the button. The room went quiet, in a way that the room had not been quiet at any point in the previous 5 nights. The refrigerator was off. The cedars were not moving. The wood stove had burned down to coals and was not ticking the way it ticks when it cools. Everything that should have been making a small sound was not making a small sound. And into that absence, a voice said, very clearly, in the cadence of someone answering a question, They had been waiting a long time to be asked. Thank you. I did not move. I want to be clear about that. I did not move because I could not, and because some older part of me that I had not consulted in years had taken over the body and was holding it still. The voice did not say anything else. The static came back gradually, the way a tide comes back. The refrigerator clicked on. The wood stove resumed its small contractions. I sat at the table for a long time before I reached out and turned the radio off. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the rocker on the porch with a blanket and watched the tree line until the sky started to go gray. And I thought about what I had done. What I had done, as I understood it then and as I understand it now, was to acknowledge something. I had been pretending for 5 days that there was nothing to acknowledge, and in one tired moment I had dropped the pretense and spoken into the room as if the room could hear me, and the room had answered. The acknowledgement was the event, not the voice. The voice was a consequence. The event was that I had stopped performing the version of myself that does not engage, and the cost of stopping that performance was that something engaged back. I am aware of how this sounds. I have had 12 years to listen to myself say it, and I am aware that it sounds like the kind of story a man tells himself to make a coincidence into a meaning. I am not asking you to believe in the voice. I am asking you to believe in what I did next, because what I did next is the part that is mine. In the morning I packed the truck, not to leave, to prepare to leave, which is a different thing. I put my bag by the door. I cleaned out the cooler. I swept the cabin and folded the blanket on the loft bed and put the dishes away in the cabinet. Then, instead of getting in the truck and driving the 4 hours home a day early like a sane man, I sat back down at the kitchen table and I turned the radio on. I want to tell you that I did this because I wanted to understand. That would be a clean reason. It would let me end this part of the story with a kind of sympathetic foolishness, the curious man overstepping. The real reason was smaller and worse. The real reason was that something had spoken to me and thanked me for listening. And in the 38 years I had been an adult, very few things had thanked me for anything, and I was not ready to walk away from the first one that had. If you have ever stayed in a situation a day longer than you should have, because leaving it would mean admitting how lonely you were inside it, you already know the shape of what I'm describing. I think most people have a version of this in their lives, even if it has nothing to do with cabins or radios. I think most people have answered something back, at least once, that they should have let pass. Be honest with yourself. You know the moment I'm talking about. The voice came in faster the second time. The static, built for maybe a minute. The cadence emerged, and then it said, in the same clear tone as before, "You came back." And I, sitting at the table with my hands flat on the wood, the way you put your hands flat when you are trying to convince yourself you are calm, said, "Yes." We talked for about an hour. I am going to use the word talked because I do not have a better one, but I want to be honest that it was not a conversation in the way two people in a room have a conversation. The voice spoke in short, complete sentences, with long pauses between them, and I answered in short, complete sentences, and between us there was a kind of rhythm that felt less like dialogue and more like two people taking turns putting stones on a pile. It asked me questions, simple ones at first. It asked me where I was from. It asked me how long I had owned the cabin. I told it the town. I told it a year. It said nothing. And then it asked me, after a long pause, whether the cedars were still bending east in the afternoon. And I felt something in my chest fold in a small, specific way. The cedars were bending east in the afternoon. I had noticed it that morning. I had not told anyone, because I had not spoken to anyone in 5 days. The voice was speaking to me about a thing it could only know if it was looking at the same trees I was looking at, or if it was looking at me, looking at them. I did not answer. The voice waited. After a while it asked me something else, something easier, and I answered that one, and we went on. But I want you to notice what I did. I want you to notice that the moment the voice said something that should have ended the conversation, I did not about end the conversation. I let the moment pass. I let it be replaced by an easier moment. This is a thing I have done my whole life, and I did not know I was doing it until I was doing it with something that was not a person. And even then I did not stop. Later in the hour, it asked me whether I was alone, and I said yes, and it said, I know. And I felt the back of my neck get cold in a way that was not fear exactly, but something like recognition. The way you feel when a stranger uses a piece of information about you that you did not give them, and you realize the conversation has not been the conversation you thought it was. It did not threaten me. I want to make that clear. Nothing it said was a threat. The closest it came was when it asked me, near the end of the hour, whether I would come back next year, and I said I did not know, and it said, you will. And there was no menace in it, only a flat certainty, the way a doctor tells you about a test result. When the static took it back, I sat at the table for another 20 minutes before I stood up. I was shaking, but not in the obvious way. The shake was somewhere behind my ribs, a low tremor that I could only feel when I tried to take a deep breath. I went outside. I stood on the porch. I looked at the tree line, and at the place where the camp chair sat just out of sight, and I understood, in a way I had not understood the day before, that I had been being watched for longer than 5 days. I did not know how I understood this. I just understood it, the way you understand that someone in a room with you has stopped liking you, before they have said anything, before their face has changed. I drove home that afternoon. I left a day early, after all, not because I had decided to leave, but because I realized at some point during the standing on the porch that my hands had already started packing the rest of the truck while I was thinking about something else. And I had learned long ago not to argue with my hands when they had decided something my head had not yet caught up to. The drive was 4 hours. I did not stop. I did not turn on the truck radio, which I want you to notice without me having to point it out. I came home, and my wife was in the kitchen making a kind of soup she makes when the weather turns, and she looked up at me and said, "You're back early." And I said, "Yeah." And she said, "Everything okay?" And I said, "Yeah." That was the first lie. Not a big one. Not a lie about a fact. A lie about a temperature. I was not okay, and I knew I was not okay, and I told her I was, because telling her the truth would have required me to start the story at a place I did not yet know how to start it. For the next several months I lived inside a quiet I could not describe to anyone. I went to work. I made coffee. I took the recycling to the curb on Tuesdays. I had dinner with my wife and asked her about her day, with what I hope was the same attention I had always asked her about her day. And I did not tell her about the cabin. I did not tell anyone about the cabin. I went on the way you go on, after something has shifted inside you that does not show on the outside. The going on was, in its own way, a continuation of the thing I had started the night I said, "What?" out loud at the kitchen table. I had answered. I had kept answering, in a sense, by not saying anything. The silence in my marriage that began that fall was a silence I was holding open on purpose, the way you hold a door open for somebody behind you, and the somebody behind me was the voice, and I was holding the door because I had not yet decided whether to close it. I want to slow down here, because this is where the story stops being about the cabin and starts being about me. And I think the people who find this kind of story tend to want the cabin part. I understand that. I am going to ask you to stay with me for the part that is harder to film. If you have ever kept a thing from someone you love, not because the thing was dangerous to them, but because telling them would have changed the way they looked at you, you know what I am about to describe. You might want to think about that thing now, while we're together. It will help you hear the rest of this, honestly. In November, my wife asked me if I was sleeping. I said I was. I was not. I had been waking up around 3 most mornings and lying in the dark, listening to the house. And the house was a normal house, and the listening was not for anything in particular, but the listening was a habit I had brought back from the cabin. The habit had a quality to it that did not belong in a bedroom in a town with street lights. She said, "You've been quiet." I said, "Work has been busy." She said, "Okay." That was the second lie. Work had not been busy. Work had been the same as it always was. I had been quiet because I was spending most of my interior life having a conversation with a voice that was not in the room, rehearsing what I would say to it the next time, and what I would not say. I did not have room left over for the small ordinary noise that a marriage runs on. There was something else in November that I want to mention, because at the time I did not connect it to anything, and now I am not so sure. I started losing small pockets of time, not blackouts, nothing dramatic. I would be driving home from work, and I would pull into the driveway, and I would not be able to remember the last 20 minutes of the drive. The radio, which I had started keeping off in the car as a discipline, would be on, not loud, just on. Tuned to static. Between stations, the dial slightly past the last frequency I would have set it to. I would turn it off. I would go inside. I would not say anything to my wife about it, because there was nothing to say. People drive home on autopilot. People bump radio dials with their elbows. These things happen. They happened to me 4 times that month. In December, I almost told her. We were driving back from her sister's, 2 hours on a dark highway, and she was asleep in the passenger seat, and the dashboard lights were the only thing on her face. And I thought, if I say it now, while she is half asleep, it will land softer, and she will hear it the way you hear something in a dream, and we can talk about it tomorrow. I opened my mouth. I closed it. I drove. She woke up when we hit the gravel of the driveway and asked if I had stayed awake okay, and I said I had. That was the 3rd lie, and the smallest, and the one that has bothered me the most over the years, because it was the one I told for no reason. In February, I went back. I want to be clear that I did not plan to. I had told myself in October that I was done with the cabin. I had told myself in November that I would sell it in the spring. I had told myself in December that I would at least not go back in winter when the road in was bad and nobody would find me if something went wrong. In February, I went back anyway. I told my wife I was going to check on the pipes. The pipes were fine. The pipes had always been fine. She knew the pipes were fine. She did not say so. She kissed me at the door and said, "Drive safe." And I said, "I will." I got in the truck and drove the 4 hours, and I did not turn on the radio, and I parked at the cabin in the late afternoon with the snow up to the bumpers, and the cedars holding their snow the way old men hold a coat closed at the throat. I did not turn on the radio that night. I want you to know that. I sat in the cabin with the wood stove going, and I read a book I had brought, and I did not turn on the radio. Around 9, the voice spoke, anyway, from the shelf, with the radio off, and it said, "You came back." I closed the book. I set it on the arm of the chair. I said, "I did." It said, "Why?" I sat with that for a long time. The honest answer was that I had come back because I could not stop thinking about it. I could not stop thinking about it because in October it had asked me about the cedars bending east, and in the 4 months since I had not been able to figure out how it had been looking at the cedars from inside my own head, and the not knowing had eaten a hole in me that I could not fill with my regular life. The honest answer was that I was lonelier in my own house than I had been in the cabin. The loneliness in my own house was a loneliness I had built. The loneliness at the cabin was at least a loneliness somebody else had built and was sharing with me. I said, "I wanted to ask you something." It said, "Ask." I said, "How did you know about the cedars?" There was a long pause. The wood stove ticked. The snow shifted on the roof. The voice said, "Your uncle used to ask me the same kind of question." I felt the room tilt. I do not mean that figuratively. I mean that the floor seemed, for a second, to be not where I had left it. I put my hand on the arm of the chair to steady myself, and I said, "He came here too." The voice said, "He came here for 30 years. I said, "What did he do here?" The voice said, "He listened, the same as you." I did not ask anything else. I want to tell you that I did, that I pressed it, that I was a man who, when given the opening, walked through it. I did not. I sat in the chair with the book closed on the arm, and I let the sentence sit in the room with me. After a while, the voice said, "You should sleep." And I said, "Okay." And I went up to the loft, and I slept, badly, but I slept. In the morning, the voice was gone, and the radio was on the shelf with the batteries still in the drawer where I had left them in October. I checked the drawer twice. I checked the shelf twice. I sat on the loft stairs with my head in my hands, and I tried to do the math of what had happened, and I could not make the math work. My uncle had owned the cabin for 31 years. He had died in his own bed at 83 of a heart that had finally stopped negotiating with him. He had not, as far as anyone in the family knew, had any unusual experiences at the cabin or anywhere else. He had been a quiet man, a widower for the last 15 years of his life, who had spent more and more time at the cabin in his retirement. I drove home the next morning. I told my wife the pipes were fine. She said, "Good." She did not ask anything else. I want to be careful here, because I do not want to make her sound like a woman who was not paying attention. She was paying attention. She had been paying attention since October. She was waiting, the way a person waits when they have decided that the other person needs to be the one to open the door. And the door I needed to open was getting heavier every month I left it closed. Spring came. Summer came. I did not go back to the cabin in the summer, though the summer was the right time to go. My wife mentioned twice that we could go up together for a weekend, and twice I found a reason we could not. The reasons were plausible: her mother's birthday, a roof estimate, a conference I was not actually required to attend. She accepted them. She accepted them in a way that let me know she was accepting them, which is its own kind of message. And I received the message and filed it. Something started happening at home that summer. I want to mention it carefully, because at the time I did not connect it to the cabin, and I am still not sure I should. The kitchen radio, which sat on a shelf above the sink in our house the same way the hand crank had sat on a shelf above the sink in the cabin, began to come on by itself. Not often. Twice in June, once in July, always when I was in the room alone, always to static, never to a station. I would walk in to make coffee, and the radio would be on at low volume, hissing. I would turn it off. I would say nothing to my wife about it, because if I said something I would have to explain why it was worth mentioning, and the only explanation I had was one I was not prepared to give. The third time it happened, in July, I unplugged it. I unplugged it from the wall, and I left the cord on the counter, where I would see it. In August, I came into the kitchen, and the radio was plugged in and on. I do not know who plugged it in. I want to be very clear that I am not saying the voice plugged it in. I am saying that I do not know who plugged it in, and that my wife denied plugging it in when I asked her, in a voice I tried to keep level, and that I believed her, because she had no reason to lie about something so small, and because she looked at me when I asked her in a way that suggested she had been waiting for me to ask her something much larger, and was disappointed that this was the thing I had chosen. I unplugged it, again. I put it in the garage. I did not buy another one. In September, I went back to the cabin, alone. I told her I was going to clear brush. I did clear brush, for about an hour, on the first afternoon, so that the lie would have a body to it. Then I went inside, and I turned on the radio, and I sat at the table, and I waited. The voice came in within minutes. It said, "You waited longer this time." I said, "I know." It said, "Why?" I said, "I was trying not to come back." It said, "I know." We talked that night for almost 3 hours. I am not going to repeat most of what was said, because most of it was the kind of conversation that would sound, written down, like nothing. It asked me about my work. It asked me about my marriage. It asked me, gently, whether I was happy, and I said I did not know, and it said, "Most people don't." And I felt, for the first time, something I want to call comfort, though comfort is too soft a word. What I really felt was the relief of being talked to by something that did not need me to perform. This is the part of the story I have the hardest time telling, because it is the part where I have to admit that the voice was good company, not good in a moral sense, good in the sense that being with it required less of me than being with anyone else in my life. It did not need me to be the man my wife had married. It did not need me to be the adjuster who could ask the second question. It did not need me to be a son or a brother or a friend. It needed me to sit at a table and answer when it spoke, and I had been doing some version of that my whole adult life, and finally there was someone for whom that was enough. If you have ever been more honest with a stranger on a plane than with the person who shares your bed, you know what I mean. You can tell me in your own head. You don't have to say it. I am not going to pretend I am the only person who has ever found it easier to be known by something that could not call him on his birthday. I went back 4 more times that fall, once in October, twice in November, once in early December, when the road was already bad. Each time the voice was easier to reach. Each time the static lasted a shorter while before the cadence came through. By November, I was sitting down at the table, and the voice was already there, mid-sentence, as if it had been waiting for me to take my coat off. In November, something else happened that I want to tell you about, because it is the part where I should have stopped, and I did not. I was at the cabin for 2 nights. On the first night, the voice asked me if I had been sleeping. I said, "Not really." It said, "You should sleep here. You sleep better here." I said, "I do?" And it said, "You always have." I had not in fact been sleeping better at the cabin. I had been sleeping the same as at home, which was badly, but after it said that, I went up to the loft, and I slept for 9 hours straight. And I woke up feeling rested in a way I had not felt rested in a year. The next night, the same thing. 9 hours. Dreamless. I came down the loft stairs in the morning, and I felt better than I had felt in months, and I sat at the table, and I drank coffee, and I thought, why would I leave? That was the thing I was thinking. Why would I leave? I had a wife at home. I had a job. I had a life. And I was sitting at a kitchen table 4 hours from any of it, thinking, why would I leave? I sat with that thought for about 10 minutes before I recognized that the thought was not mine. I do not mean that someone put it in my head. I mean that the shape of it was not the shape of how I think. I am a man who leaves. I have always been a man who leaves. Leaving is what I do. And I was sitting at that table in that cabin, thinking the opposite of what I think, and I did not notice. And that was the moment I should have gotten in the truck, and I did not. My wife stopped asking when I would be home. She started leaving the porch light on without saying anything about it. I started coming in late and finding a plate in the microwave with a paper towel over it, and I started eating the plate at the kitchen table in my coat, because taking the coat off felt like a commitment I had not earned. In December, on the last visit, the voice asked me to do something. I want to be careful with this part, too, because I know how it will sound. I have spent 12 years figuring out how to say it without making it sound like the kind of thing it was not. The voice did not ask me to hurt anyone. It did not ask me to bring it anything. It did not ask me to do anything that, in the moment, felt wrong. It asked me to stop coming. It said, "You should not come back after this." I said, "Why?" It said, "Because you are starting to like it here more than you should." I sat with that. The wood stove was going. The snow was light that night, a kind of dust that the wind kept lifting off the roof and putting back down. I said, "What happens if I keep coming?" It said, "You will keep coming." I said, "That isn't an answer." It said, "It is." There was a longer pause than there had been in any of our conversations. Then the voice said something I have not been able to put down since. It said, "Your uncle came back. He came back for 30 years. You should not be like him." I said, "What happened to him?" The voice said, "Nothing happened to him. That is what happened to him." I drove home the next morning. I did not say goodbye to it, because saying goodbye would have been an agreement, and I was not ready to agree. I drove the 4 hours with my hands at 10 and 2, and the truck radio off. I came in the back door, and my wife was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and she looked at me, and she said, "We need to talk." She had found in the glove box of the truck a receipt from a gas station 40 miles from the cabin, dated 3 weeks earlier, on a day I had told her I was at a work thing in the city. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking for the registration. The receipt had been folded inside it, the way I fold receipts when I am not paying attention. She had unfolded it. She had seen the date. She had sat with it for a week before saying anything, because she was the kind of woman who sat with things before she said them. I told her, that night, the version of the story I could tell. I told her about the cabin, and the radio, and the voice. I did not tell her about the camp chair. The camp chair seemed, in the kitchen, like a detail that would make the rest of it sound less true. I did not tell her about the man in the green jacket, for the same reason. I did not tell her about the kitchen radio that had plugged itself in. I did not tell her about the lost 20 minutes on the drive home. I told her enough that she could understand why I had been going back, and I let her think that the going back had been about grief, about my uncle, about a kind of haunting I was working through. She accepted that. She accepted it the way she had accepted the brush clearing and the pipes, which is to say she accepted the shape of it without believing the substance. She asked me, at the end, whether I was going to go back again. I said, no. That was the fourth lie, and the largest, and the one I am still inside of. I did not go back that winter. I did not go back the next spring. I did not go back for almost 2 years. During those 2 years, I was, by every external measure, a better husband than I had been the year before. I was home. I was present. I cooked sometimes. I went with her to her sister's and stayed awake on the drive back. I let her see me. I let her see a version of me anyway, the version that had decided to stay in the room. But there is something I have not told you about those 2 years, and I want to tell you now, because if I leave it out, the rest of this will not make sense. The voice followed me home. I do not mean that in a haunted house way. I do not mean that I heard it speaking in the kitchen radio I had put in the garage, or in the car, or in the bathroom mirror. I mean that I started having conversations with it in my head. Not all the time, not every day, but often enough that I noticed, and then often enough that I stopped noticing, and then often enough that I could not have stopped if I had tried. I would be at work, and I would be writing up a claim, and I would think, what would it say about this? I would be at dinner with my wife, and she would say something, and I would think, it would have asked her a different question. I would be lying in bed at 3 in the morning, and I would rehearse in my head the conversation I would have with it if I went back, and the conversation would go on for an hour, and I would fall asleep mid-sentence, and in the morning I would not be sure which parts of the conversation I had imagined and which parts I had remembered from the cabin. I started saying things out loud to nobody in the house when my wife was not home. Small things. You would like this song. You would have laughed at that. I would catch myself doing it, and I would stop, and I would feel the embarrassment of a man who has caught himself talking to a dog that is not in the room, and I would go on with my afternoon. But the talking did not stop. It just got quieter. My wife noticed. Of course, she noticed. She did not ask. She had asked enough. She was waiting for me to either come back to her or finish leaving, and she was not going to make either one easier for me. In the 3rd year I went back. I told her. That is the only thing I want to say in my own defense. I told her I was going. I told her why. I told her I did not know what I would find when I got there, or whether the voice would still be there, or whether I would come back the same. She did not try to stop me. She said, I'd rather you went and came back than stayed and resented me. She said, but I want you to know that if you go and you don't come back the same, I am not going to pretend you did. I drove the 4 hours. The cabin was the cabin. The cedars had grown a little, or I had shrunk a little. The radio was on the shelf. I turned it on. I sat at the table. Nothing happened. I sat there for an hour. I cranked the radio. I changed the batteries. I tried the county station, which came in fine, a woman reading a school board agenda. I turned it off. I turned it on. I said out loud, "Are you there?" "Nothing," I said. "I came back." Nothing. The static was just static. The room was just a room. The wood stove ticked when I lit it, and the cedars moved when the wind moved them, and there was no cadence under anything, and no voice said my name or thanked me or asked me why. I stayed 3 days. I cleared brush. I read the book I had brought. I walked the property line, and at the southwest corner, the camp chair was gone. The rings around its feet had filled in with leaves and time. There was no sign that anyone had been on the other side of the line in a long while. But there was something else, and I want to tell you about it, because it is the thing I have the hardest time explaining to myself. On the second night, I went out to the porch around 11, because I could not sleep. I sat in the rocker. I looked at the tree line, and on the far side of the clearing, in the place where the camp chair used to be, I saw a cigarette ember. Just the ember, a small orange point in the dark, at about the height a person's hand would be if they were sitting down. It glowed brighter for a second, the way an ember glows when somebody draws on it, and then it dimmed, and then it glowed again, and then it dimmed. I watched it for maybe 2 minutes. It did not move. It pulsed at the rhythm of someone smoking slowly. Then it went out. My uncle smoked. He smoked the whole time I knew him. He smoked unfiltered cigarettes that he rolled himself, and he smoked them slowly, drawing on them with long pauses between, the way a man smokes when he is thinking about something he cannot say. I sat on the porch until the sky went gray. I did not see the ember again. In the morning I walked to the place where it had been, and there was nothing on the ground. No butt, no ash, no mark. The leaves were undisturbed. I went back to the cabin, and I packed my truck, and I drove home that day instead of the next. I drove home, and I told my wife the truth, which was that nothing had happened. I did not tell her about the ember. I told her the radio had been quiet, and the cabin had been empty, and that I thought I was done. She nodded. She said, "Okay." We made dinner. We went to bed. I lay awake until 3 the way I had been lying awake until 3 for years. And I listened to the house, and the house was a house, and the listening was a habit I could not put down. Here is the part I have not said yet, and the part I am saying now because I am 58, and I have decided that the saying is the only thing left that might matter. I have spent 12 years telling myself that the voice was real. I have spent 12 years telling myself, alternately, that the voice was not real, and that I had a small breakdown in my late 40s that I covered up with a story I could live inside. I have gone back and forth between these two explanations, the way a man paces a room he does not want to leave, and I have not been able to settle on either one, because settling on either one would require me to give up the other, and I have needed both. If the voice was real, then I am a man who was chosen by something, briefly, and who walked away from it, and who has spent the rest of his life feeling the shape of what he walked away from, like a tooth that has been pulled. If the voice was not real, then I am a man who, at 46, was so lonely inside his own life that he invented a companion who could not call him on his birthday, and who let that invention rearrange his marriage for years, and who is still, at 58, organizing his interior life around the memory of a conversation he had with himself at a kitchen table in the woods. I do not know which is worse. I have stopped trying to decide. I think the not deciding is the consequence I have been describing this whole time without naming it. And I think the consequence is permanent. And I think anyone who has had a quiet thing happen to them in a quiet place and then carried it home alone knows what I mean. But there is a third possibility, and I have only started to consider it in the last year, and I want to say it now, because I think it is the one that is true. I do not think the voice was the same voice for every person. I do not think it was a fixed thing that lived in the cabin and waited for visitors. I think it was a shape that took the shape of whoever answered it. I think my uncle answered it, in his own way, for 30 years. And I think the voice that answered him was a voice that fit the man he was. And I think the voice that answered me was a voice that fit the man I was. I think it told him whatever he needed to hear to keep coming back. And I think it told me whatever I needed to hear to keep coming back. And the only reason I stopped coming back was that, somewhere inside me, the man who needed to keep coming back finally lost an argument with the man who knew what coming back was costing. I think my uncle never had that argument. I think he had 30 years of conversation with something that was, in some sense, just the part of him he could not say out loud at family dinners. I think he died in his own bed at 83, having been more honest with that voice than he ever was with anyone alive. And I think, when the voice told me, "You should not be like him," it was not warning me. It was inviting me. It was telling me what my version of his 30 years would look like, and it was waiting to see whether I would choose it. I am going to tell you one more thing, and then I am going to stop, because this is the part where most stories like this one offer a shape, and I do not have a shape to offer. I sold the cabin last year. I want you to know that. I did not tell my wife I was selling it until the papers were signed, because I did not want her to talk me out of it, and I did not want her to talk me into it. And I wanted, for once, to do something about that place without consulting anybody, including myself. The man who bought it is a contractor from 2 states over who plans to tear it down and put up something with better insulation. I did not tell him about the radio. I did not tell him about the camp chair. I did not tell him anything except where the well was and which damper to leave cracked on the wood stove. He thanked me. I drove away. I have not been back. I thought, when I signed the papers, that I would feel something. Relief, maybe. Or grief. Or the particular kind of lightness you feel when you put down a thing you have been carrying for so long that you had forgotten it was a thing and not a part of your body. I did not feel any of that. I felt the way I feel most days, which is to say I felt like a man who has been listening for a sound that is not coming, and who has decided today not to be disappointed about it, and who knows that tomorrow he will have to decide again. Last week, my wife asked me a question at dinner. She asked it the way she asks about the weather, with no weight on it, and I knew, the way you know these things after 33 years, that she had been waiting for the right night to ask it. She said, "Have you been talking to someone?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "At night, in your sleep, you've been having conversations, long ones. You stop and you wait, and then you answer, like there's somebody there. It's been happening for about a month." I sat with my fork halfway to my mouth. I put it down. I said, "What do I say?" She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Mostly you just say yes. I want to tell you that I asked her more. I want to tell you that I pressed her, that I sat with her and we talked it through, that I told her about the cabin, the real version, the one with the camp chair and the ember and the kitchen radio that plugged itself back in. I did not. I said, "I've been having weird dreams." I said, "I'll see if it stops." She said, "Okay." We finished dinner. We watched something on television. We went to bed. That was the 5th lie. And I am not going to tell you whether I told it because I did not want to scare her, or because I did not want to give the thing she had described a name, or because some part of me, the part I have spent 12 years not consulting, did not want her to make me stop. I think you already know what I think. I think you have been ahead of me for a while now. I think that is why you are still here. I'm going to make another cup of coffee now. My wife will be up soon. We will have the kind of morning we have been having for 33 years, which is a good morning by most measures, and I will not tell her any of this, because I have already told her the version she can live with. I will tell you one last thing, and then I will go. 3 nights ago I woke up at 3 in the morning, the way I always wake up at 3 in the morning, and I lay in the dark, and I listened to the house. The house was a house. The refrigerator was deciding things. The furnace was making the small contractions a furnace makes. Everything was as it should be. And under all of it, very quietly, so quietly I could only hear it. Because I have been listening for 12 years, there was a rhythm, like somebody breathing into a microphone at the wrong end of a long hallway. I did not answer it. I want you to know that. I lay there with my eyes open, and I did not answer it. I have learned that much. I have learned that you do not answer. But I lay there for a long time, listening. And somewhere in the dark, in the part of myself I have spent 12 years pretending I closed, I felt something shift its weight, the way a person shifts their weight when they have been waiting a long time and have just heard the door downstairs. And I understood then that I had not closed it after all. I had only stopped speaking. The door I opened at the kitchen table 12 years ago is still open. It has been open the whole time. And whatever has been on the other side of it has been patient. And it has been listening. And it has been getting closer in the only way something like that can get closer, which is by waiting until you are old enough and tired enough and alone enough at 3 in the morning to forget, one more time, the lesson you spent your whole life practicing. I think it is almost ready to say my name again. I think, this time, I am going to answer.